Through his telescope, Captain William Sutton could clearly see the puff of whitish smoke erupt from the smaller of the two ships. Almost simultaneously, the Pelican's fore topsail tore across its width. As the sail collapsed, he heard an exclamation of joy beside him. "Well done, sir, well done." Captain Sutton ignored the comment. He was still counting, waiting for the boom that was only just now rolling across the ocean and across the deck of the Lady Scarlet. Yes, he thought, mentally calculating the distance they were gaining. "One should not be too presumptuous, mister," he said condescendingly without taking his eye from the glass. "No, sir, one should not." The voice had lost most of its excitement. "We are dealing with a cunning one, mister, probably the wiliest of them all." "Of course, sir, and God willing you shall be the one to put an end to him." "Be it so, mister, but many have assumed that before, and we must be on our most vigilant, lest he slips from our grasp as well." "Your plan is working well, sir. The sloop's to slow, take his wind, and shepherd the Pelican into the slack water, where we can take her." "Apparently so, mister, though I care that things can go awry when one least expects." "Take that slack water, no doubt after all his time slipping out of the noose. Butcher is cursing a becalmed area in the middle of the sea. Seems even God himself wants the butcher taken, sir." "Aye, or the devil looks after his own." One of the sloops had come up behind, its sails spoiling the smooth flow of air that had filled the Pelican's own sails. Without being told, crew were immediately climbing into the rigging. They had trimmed and got back most of the lost air when they heard the roar of cannon. Almost in the same instant, a hole appeared in the fore topsail. They all knew instantly that it was bar or chain, intentional fire to take out the Pelican's sails. As they thought the thought, there was a tearing sound as the canvas tore across its breadth. "Mr. Sims, attend to the sail." Jake's voice was sharp and urgent. The sailor's reply was raised in apprehension, and tinged with more than a dose of fear. "Captain, they'll be within broadside shot afore long?" "Aye, Mr. Sims." Jake spoke calmly. "I can see from his elf." Though the words were deceptive, for in fact his gaze was in the opposite direction, away from the following ships, and anxious faces of his crew. The mate's body sagged. He was a simple, though not unintelligent man, and he knew that individually the fast ships that pursued them were no match for the Pelican. There were 3 frigates and 2 sloops. The cannon they carried were not heavy, but what they lacked in fighting strength, they more than made up for in number. They had tasted blood, and would not give up the chase. They would fight, and maybe lose, sinking to the bottom of the sea. Testimony again to the feared reputation of Captain Jake Barber. But together the battle was unequal. Even a pirate as fearsome as Jake could not fight 5 at a time, and they had a plan. The Pelican's only advantage was that once closed in for the kill, they would have no room to maneuver. Nonetheless, the prize was worth the risk of dying for: fame for the captains, and a vast reward for their crew. Even Sims knew that sooner or later Jack would be dragged in shackles to swing at the end of a rope, and likely the mate would be by his side. It wasn't something he relished, and he was desperate to say again that time was running out, but he had been dismissed by attitude, and that was more final than words. He began to descend the steps to the lower deck. He stopped, turned again, and looked expectantly at the tall black-dressed figure, waiting, hoping the captain would acknowledge his unspoken plea. But the man was silent. He still looked out over the glass like water, across the open ocean. Ignoring the waiting man and apparently, the fully rigged Navy ships slowly closing the gap on them, as they wallowed through lack of strong wind. Now Sims looked anxiously at the crew a few steps below him. They were all at their stations, ready and waiting for the order to fight. Yet each man knew they were outgunned and outnumbered. Nervously the sailor spoke again, his voice nervous and pleading. "Begging your pardon, Captain." He almost lost the courage to continue. We can ill afford to meet them broadside, with their cannon and all, if you were ready to give th. Gone was the calm. The words were spat. If I were ready to what? Mister? The tone of his voice chilled all of those who had the misfortune to hear it. Since when have you thought it fitting to tell the captain what to do on his own bridge, Mr. Sims? There was a deathly silence, except for the sharp snap of sail as it caught an errant gust of wind. I, Jake Barber, captain of the Pelican. I alone decide what is done aboard her. His voice lost some of its power, but none of its venom. You would be well advised not to forget again, miss. Something caught his attention, relieving the sweating man of his berating. Get back to your duties, all of you, before I have you heaved overboard to wait for the king's men. In an instant the sailor was gone, the words following, as he meekly joined the others on the main deck. There were just the two of them left on the bridge, then quickly Jack once more looked ahead. The helmsman, alone at his post behind the large timber wheel, took a cautious glance at the captain. He would have sworn that the captain was looking for something, but there was nothing that his eyes could set upon, here in the vast emptiness of ocean. The sloop, apparently content with its delaying work, stayed where it was least exposed as the larger warships gained on them. The other sloop had come close behind, seemingly also satisfied to harry the Pelican towards the strange area of slack water. Sailors are a superstitious lot, and areas like it were treated with the utmost distrust. Some said nature created strange things, most said it was the work of evil spirits, and places where merfolk waited to lure sailors to their death. Jack was not of the second group, as for some time they held their course. The only sound on deck was the creak of wet ropes straining against timber pulleys, and occasionally the flap of a sail that momentarily lost its wind, quickly refilled by the anxious crew pulling rope under Jack's scowling stare. Then his voice, loud and clear, "Helm, take us there." Following his lead, the man spun the wheel starboard, towards a small but dense mist that had begun to form. It hadn't been there moments before, at least if it had, none had seen it. Suddenly Jack's mood changed, becoming almost jovial, as he took the helmsman into his confidence. "We cannot fight them in a fair fight, or even a dirty one. But let us see how well they can battle on my terms." Minutes later they smelt the first wisps of the salt-laden fog, but now with it, their sails emptied, and the wind that had sluggishly driven them ahead of the Navy ships began to gust and fade. The sails flapped and fluttered as the frigates bore down on them, still driven by the freshening wind. The Pelican coasted under diminishing momentum into the mist. The fog rolled onto the deck. "Prepare to heave to, helm." Jack laughed out loud as the thick wisps curled around the masts and cut them off from sight of the king's ships. He called to the men waiting on the deck, as they too began to disappear from his view. "Strike the sails, and do it with no noise." At last Jack could release his fingers from the red stone that he held in his palm. Captain Sutton scowled as he saw the stern of the Pelican fade into the gloom. "Mister, signal the others, find its extent and set up a picket line." Harrington stomped back to his quarters, thinking that the butcher had yet again slipped from certain capture. The devil certainly did look after his own. Sarah suddenly realized what he had said, and meant. Grinning, she lifted herself up out of the water. "Steve?" Her father was now shouting to her brother, treading water some 30 meters away, his snorkel and mask drawn back over his head. They could have been twins, if it had not been for the years separating their births. Both had the deep blue eyes, and sun-bleached hair that flowed down to their shoulders, Steve's as long as hers. The boy had seen the container that was being waved at them and was quickly pulling the mask back on. He dived, and with an almost imperceptible splash the rubber fins slipped below the transparent surface of the lagoon. Sarah tied a towel around her waist as she stood by their father. They could see Steve, below the surface, swimming above the sandy bottom, madly working his legs, driving himself towards the Julianne, as if his life depended on it. It didn't, but that was how Steve approached everything in life, with an energy and enthusiasm that was hard to compete against. The trouble was he wouldn't grow up. It really annoyed her sometimes. "He's just a little immature, dear," her mother would say, when Sarah had once again died of embarrassment at some act he had performed in front of her friends. "He'll grow up to be a man one day." Some hope, Sarah thought. The boy was about 10 meters away when Mike, their father, started to spill the bucket's contents into the water. Almost immediately fish appeared as if from nowhere, darting back and forth catching the slowly sinking scraps. More and more were coming as the last dregs of the container spilled into the lagoon, temporarily discoloring the crystal clarity moments before the surface appeared to boil as fish shot in from all directions to catch the disappearing morsels. In amongst the middle of it all was a snorkel pipe, thrust up into the air, seemingly pushing through the massive fin and scale so that hardly anything of the boy could be seen. Within minutes it was over, and only a few red and green parrotfish busied around the bottom for the last and smallest remaining pieces. Then they too were gone, leaving nothing but a rapidly dissipating stain that would soon settle to feed the bottom dwellers. The boy was again on the surface treading water. "We're leaving soon, and there's work to be done," said his father. The boy mumbled something nobody could hear, but came aboard, and like Sarah went down into the cabin to help. Mike Porter started the electric winch. The chain rattled up, pulling the anchor from the sandy bottom. Opening the throttle, the engine, with its familiar chug-a-chug-chug, began to push them away from the beach. As the yacht approached the gap in the reef, the crashing noise of the breaking waves throwing themselves onto it increased, as did the swell. But the Julianne answered to their father's touch on the tiller, and sliced through the turbulent patch of surf into the open ocean. A few minutes later, well clear of the reef, he broke out the sails. There was a loud crack, as the wind took the flapping white canvas and filled it. Almost immediately the boat heeled over as they tacked to take advantage of the direction the wind was blowing from. The salty spray once more bathed their skin, as the yacht picked up and lifted to the call. They would be far, far away from the island and its surrounding reefs before nightfall. Now, as they sailed away, the whole island slowly came into view. They had anchored at the southern tip. The white strip of sand inside the lagoon that had seemed to beckon them could still just be seen. A low rock headland, thrusting into the sea, bare and exposed, curled to the south. Moving north, the land rose up to a rainforest-covered ridge that ran the length of the island. Barely a kilometer away, at the northern promontory, the rainforest lost its hold on the stony ground, and here a basalt cliff fell sheer, to be engulfed in the waves that swept in from the open ocean to smash at its base. Further, and practically every piece of ground was covered in thick jungle, as Steve liked to call it. The higher areas appeared to be loose gravel slopes. These parts of the island had been off limits as too dangerous, but that was little loss. They had spent 5 wonderful days on the beach, in the water, or exploring. Looking shoreward, as they moved around the coastline, it now seemed such a contradiction. Back there on the beach had been so benign, and yet here it was so violent. All in all, it was a magical place to spend the few weeks before Sarah left home to begin university. Magical seemed an apt description. It was a stroke of luck they saw the peak on the horizon. There was nothing marked on their map, and they hadn't even known there was any dry land anywhere close. At the time, Mike was quite annoyed, muttering that he had mistakenly bought a cheap map, and how he had now lost a good bit of faith in its accuracy. Still, he had later conceded things did work out well in the end. As they passed around the northern point, Sarah caught sight of what appeared to be a break in the cliffs, and through that an open area with something white. It could have been sand, or something else, but as soon as she had spotted it, it was gone. The Julienne cut through the water, and the only land for 500 kilometers dropped behind them. Sadly, Sarah turned her eyes away and towards the bow. Under sail and a fair wind, there was nothing more to do but wait for dinner. She lay back on the cabin roof to read, but soon fell asleep. What woke her was not immediately clear, although it could have been the chill in the air. Whatever it had been, she was wide awake. She became aware that there was no longer any swell or forward movement of the yacht. Propping herself up on her elbows and looking around, it was obvious that both the wind and the sun had gone. They were drifting into a light mist. It slowly swept over the deck, obscuring her vision, as low rain clouds on mountain roads would do. Steve raced back from the bow. "Where did it come from, Dad?" "I guess I must have been daydreaming. I didn't see it coming. It was suddenly just there." The others, below deck, had become curious at the lack of movement. First Kurt, then Hannah, his traveling companion, and Carol, their mother, came up the narrow stair from the cabin. "What's wrong? Have we stopped?" she asked. "We've not stopped. It's nothing to be worried about, a bit of fog. I'll start the auxiliary." But fog here, it was too beautiful afternoon, and their mother was not satisfied with the explanation. "Just a patch of cold water, or extra hot air. It'll soon clear," he replied. But it didn't, and in the following minutes the mist thickened, and all except Mike retreated to the more congenial surrounds inside the hull. After about 2 hours, just as everybody had accepted and become used to their plight, the Julienne violently heeled over to starboard. There was a crash of crockery as the readied lunch was strewn over the floor of the cabin. Taken by surprise at the unexpected movement, worried faces again emerged onto the rear deck. "What happened, Mike?" Now it was Kurt anxiously coming to his side. "There was a ship." Mike's face was white with shock. "Right there, off to the port bow, right in front of us." They all gazed out into the swirling mist. It was like a big high wall. "I don't know how I missed it." "A big ship?" asked Kurt doubtfully. "Well, big enough." Mike turned to the young German, now standing against the radar screen. He was looking at the pale green display, and shaking his head. "There's nothing on the screen," he said. "There must be, Kurt." Mike protested, as much in embarrassment as denial. "I nearly hit it. It looked like a Chinese junk, timber, with a row of square windows, and a light inside. I looked up as we went under its stern." His words trailed away as he saw for himself. Kurt was right. For 10 kilometers around them, the distance the scan was set for, the sea was empty. For another hour they crept slowly forward, always with someone at the bow, searching ahead for danger, no longer trusting to anything but their own eyesight. But there was no sign again of the mystery boat, although several times one or the other imagined a ghostly shape out at the edge of their vision. Down in the cabin, Steve lay in the top bunk, his sense of mischief stimulated by the encounter. He gauged the feeling of unease that now pervaded the vessel. "Do you know that the pirate Captain Barber used to sail these waters?" He said it to no one in particular, and in a way that was more a statement than a question. It had the desired effect. Both Sarah and Hannah looked up at him. "That's enough, Steve," chided his mother, sensing what he was up to. "It's true, Mom. It's in a magazine I bought in Lake Street, before we left. Unexplained Mysteries of the South Pacific, it's called. Rubbish you're having us on." "I'm not Sarah. I read it. It said he used to come down here, and disappear into his secret hideout, when things got too hot for him in the Indian Ocean. Well, if he used to disappear, how come they knew he came down here then? I can't remember why, but they said he did. His voice trailed off, as he was unable to think of any sensible retort. Sarah realized he couldn't answer. "Show us where it says so," she pressed. "I can't remember where I put it." "Duh." She grunted, and went back to her own reading. 5 minutes later, Steve suddenly muttered to himself, "Yes, I do." Pulling blankets and clothes out from the bottom of his bedside locker, he produced a paperback book. He thumbed through the well-worn pages to the chapter he wanted. "Here it is," he announced. They pretended to ignore him, but they still listened. Captain Jake Barber, born Edward Jake Drew, Bristol, England, 1754. Originally a buccaneer working for the Crown, but found that it was more profitable working for himself. In 1792 he captured a Spanish galleon of 24 guns, renamed it the Pelican, and started his short and brutal career. He earned his nickname the Butcher because every prisoner he took was butchered. There was a quiet in the cabin. Regardless of their intentions, they were all listening to him. During 1793 he is believed to have taken the treasure ship of Conchar Khan, off the east coast of India. Reputedly included in the cash taken, was a gem called the Prophet's Heart, or ruby as big as a man's palm. Steve's words trailed softly away, as he himself was caught up in the web he was weaving. It was claimed the jewel had magical properties. For a moment there was silence, until Steve realized it was he who had stopped talking. He cleared his throat, and carried on. Towards the end of the same year, the Pelican was pursued by 5 Royal Navy men of war. It was chased by them into the Central Pacific, and was close to being taken when Steve stopped. They were all looking at him. And was close to being taken when the Pelican sailed into a sea fog, and vanished. He looked up. All 3 women had returned nervously to what they had previously been doing. A smile of immense pleasure spread over his face. He had got them spooked. Fearing that a surprise close-quarters attack would befall them, the warships did not follow. Instead, they circumnavigated the phenomenon, and waited until it cleared 5 days later. Neither Captain Barber, the Pelican and its crew, nor the Prophet's Heart were ever seen, or heard of again. Steve didn't look up. This time even he was hooked. An Admiralty report of the time stated that the captain commanding the chase vessels, a William Sutton, said it was the most peculiar experience of his entire naval career, for the fog never moved its position the whole time that they observed it. He retired on returning to England, and all further records referring to the event were accidentally destroyed in a fire shortly after. There was quiet in the cabin for a long while. Just the chug of the diesel, and the lapping of the waves outside the hull could be heard. Steve noticed with some satisfaction that Sarah had been on the same page of her novel the entire time he had been quoting from his book. He put the magazine down. "So at last my brother has learned some history, although what all that has got to do with us, or anything, I'm sure I don't know." It was said sarcastically, but the tone of her voice betrayed the foreboding that they all felt. For once Steve had not been a little hurt by her words. His voice was slow and calm. "It was here, Sarah. It was here that he disappeared. In a fog, just the same as this. If this Captain Butcher murder all who meet him, how is it that he is known of?" asked Hannah. "He couldn't kill everybody he met." Steve grabbed at what seemed a reason, but the moment of suspense had been broken. He was losing his gullible audience. Quickly he tried another approach. "Tell me why nobody told us about the island then?" That had been true. It had not been marked on the charts, but then neither were other small islands that dotted the Central Pacific. Even with satellite technology, physical surveys of vast areas of ocean were costly and time-consuming, and occasionally, providing they were all well off the normal shipping or tourist routes, surveys became a low priority. Kurt came down the steps from the deck hearing the last part of his question. The Japanese and probably the Americans knew it was here during the Second World War. My grandfather was on an undersea boat, what the Allies called a U-boat, and he told me that we sometimes used isolated places for submarine resupply. Many were classified as secret and left unmarked on charts of the area. Steve remembered the bits and pieces of rusted equipment they had found scattered about. Is that why Dad didn't want us looking around, in case we found some bombs? I don't think either of them were interested in the place. No harbor, no room for an airfield, and miles away from the fighting. Steve retreated back from the conversation in a slight sulk. He had ended up frightening no one, well, at least not for long, but it had been a good try. Of course, Kurt added. It could have been the location for coast watching. Sarah seemed much more attentive to Kurt's ideas than Steve's. What for? It was common for a small group of soldiers to be left in isolated places where they could observe and record shipping or aircraft passing by. Collected together with various other watch sites, it could be essential information to work out fleet and troop movements. Carol spoke. Then the men who were here should have considered themselves very lucky to be away from the brutality of fighting. Not so, Kurt said ruefully. Nationalistic feelings were high at the time, so some would have considered it shaming. There was still a feeling on unease a short while later when Mike called them back up on deck. Can you hear anything? He asked curiously. They all listened, but Hannah was the first to speak. A rumbling sound, thunder it is. It was deadened by the fog, but soon all the others could hear it too. It's not the ghost ship again, said Steve, half believing himself. Carol stood at the radar. There's nothing showing up here. She was leaning her head trying to locate the sound. It's too constant to be a storm. It was a hunch as she peered at the radar screen, and initially she rejected the notion, but then the thought hit her like a fist. It's a reef? She said disbelievingly, as her eyes flicked between the depth sounder and the radar. There's nothing showing on either, Mike. We have deep water under us, but it must be a reef, and it must be very low into the waves. Mike was doubtful. Out here. It can't. But panic was already beginning to sweep over them. We'll be on the safe side. Everybody, life jackets on. Carol, take the girls below. He called urgently. I can help. Carol protested. Not on deck, not right now. Just get everything ready in case we have to. Just be ready to get off quick. He was starting the auxiliary. Kurt, Steve, get the sails down. I can't believe it, muttered Kurt, passing him, still feeling he should have seen something earlier. In moments the sails were collapsing onto the deck and Kurt was doing the best he could to roll them. Steve, go up front. Keep watching and try to see if you can spot anything, and secure a lifeline, he called after his son. There was as close to fear as the children had ever heard in their father's voice. The sound of crashing of waves was becoming incredibly loud, and seemed to be all around them. Mike didn't know which way to steer. Logic told him away, but the swell was building and even a slight deviation made the boat heave. He could only hope they would go in the right direction. We must be almost on it. He shouted above the noise, but Carol's bewildered look through the spray screen told him there was still no sign of anything unusual on the radar. Mike had slowed the engine to almost idle, and the Julianne was being pushed forward by the swell. He threw it into reverse, trying to keep control of some headway. Mike, cried out Carol urgently. Something's on the radar. It's big. It's... Suddenly the fog thinned, and there, right in front of them, was the reef, near enough that the spray from it reached back to drench their clothes. There, over there. Go that way, shouted Steve, pointing to their left. 20 meters away, a break in the line of light foaming water marked what was hopefully a channel through to the other side. Mike pulled the tiller hard over, putting the Julian almost broadside onto the swell. The boat leaned crazily over, driven by the immense weight of water building up heavily on one side. The top of the masts dipped so low that it seemed down past the leaping foam. Now Mike opened the throttle wide as the boat struggled toward the gap. Then, what they had feared happened. There was a bone-shattering crunch, and a shudder ran through the steel hull. Immediately it was followed by a high-pitched scraping, grinding noise.